They said she couldn't survive without a man, an Apache girl born between two worlds, clinging to love as if it were breath itself. But when a rancher with a scarred past found her wandering the desert, something shifted. The town whispered he'd save her. Others said he'd ruin her. No one expected what really happened next. Because sometimes, salvation doesn't look like mercy, and sometimes, love rides in with a gun in its hand and a storm behind its eyes. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you love Wild West stories. The sun hung merciless and white over the barren horizon, burning the sand into glass and silence into something alive. Samuel Hart rode slow, reins slack in his scarred hand, the rhythmic creak of saddle leather the only sound between him and the empty desert. He'd come looking for a lost calf, but the land had a way of giving back what you weren't searching for. Something flickered in the sage ahead, too still to be wind, too small to be a coyote. He drew his rifle, the habit of war still wired into his bones, and nudged his horse forward. What he found wasn't an enemy. It was a girl. Barefoot, skin cracked from heat, clothes torn to ribbons, her black hair tangled with dust and blood. She looked like a ghost carved from the desert itself, but when she opened her eyes, they burned with life, feral, defiant, ancient. A turquoise charm hung from her fingers, broken in half, its strings licked with sweat. She whispered something he didn't understand, a language older than the fences that carved this land apart, and then she fell forward into the dirt. Samuel dismounted, the dry wind stinging his eyes. For a long moment he stood over her, torn between the old rules and the old guilt, the rule that said don't interfere, and the guilt that whispered you've left too many to die already. He saw the bruises on her arms, the dried blood along her jawline. Whoever had done this hadn't meant for her to see another sunrise. The land was cruel enough without man's cruelty added to it. His hand twitched toward his holster, not out of fear, but reflex, the way a man who's seen too much death guards against surprise. The rifle's shadow cut across her still body. Then he sighed. "Damn it," he muttered, his voice low and rough, swallowed by the wind. He slung the weapon onto his back, bent down, and lifted her. She was lighter than she looked, heat radiating from her skin, heartbeat faint against his chest. As he hoisted her onto his horse, the charm fell into the sand. Samuel paused, picked it up, and studied the fracture, half a symbol, something sacred maybe. He didn't know what it meant, but it felt like something worth not losing. He tucked it into his vest pocket. The horse shifted, uneasy under the weight of two souls, one nearly gone. Samuel glanced at the horizon, a white blur that stretched forever, and then at the girl slumped against the saddle horn. "Hold on," he whispered, though she couldn't hear him. The road back to his ranch stretched 20 miles of dust and silence. By the time the first thunderclouds began to form over the distant hills, the girl stirred, whispering a name that wasn't his. He didn't ask whose. He just rode on, the sound of the wind filling the spaces between them. For the first time in years, Samuel Hart didn't feel entirely alone. The storm rolled in that night like an uninvited guest, thunder shaking the rafters of the Hart ranch while rain clawed at the windows, and under that raw sound of heaven breaking, Samuel Hart carried the girl inside. He laid her on the cot near the hearth, wrapped her in an old wool blanket that still smelled faintly of cedar and horses, then set a pot to boil on the stove. The firelight flickered across her face, sharp cheekbones, sunburned skin, and a scar tracing the side of her neck like a story someone had tried to erase. When she woke, it was with a gasp and the kind of panic that lives deep in the bones. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for danger, but Samuel only raised his palms, saying nothing. Words were useless at first, fear was a language they both understood. Days passed slow as molasses. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat unless he left the room. The ranch hands avoided the house, their whispers carrying across the corral like dry leaves. Hart's lost his damn mind, taken in an Apache. One man quit outright. The other stayed out of loyalty, or curiosity, or maybe both. Samuel didn't blame them, he hardly understood his own reasons. Something in her silence anchored him, a mirror to the quiet that had followed him since the war, when comrades' faces had disappeared into smoke and he'd returned home with a heart half-charred. One morning, as dawn spilled over the mesa, she finally spoke. "Aiyana," she said softly, voice cracked but certain. "It means eternal blossom." The name lingered in the air like the scent of rain on dry ground. She watched him carefully, as if measuring how much of herself she could risk revealing. He nodded once, poured her coffee, black, bitter, steaming, and handed it over without ceremony. She took it, eyes never leaving his. After that, she began moving through the house like wind, quiet but present. She swept the floors, mended an old shirt, even fed the chickens with the same gentleness she used to touch her necklace, now repaired with a piece of twine he'd found. Still, she never smiled. At dusk she'd stand outside, looking toward the horizon, her expression unreadable, as though she were listening for voices carried by the wind. Samuel sometimes watched from the doorway, hat in hand, the sun bleeding red behind her silhouette, and wondered who she was waiting for, or what. The cattlemen in town had their stories. Some said she was a runaway, others that she was cursed. The whispers reached even the preacher, who muttered something about sins of compassion. But Samuel said nothing, not even when Sheriff Dane stopped by and asked straight out, "You sure you know what you're doing, Sam?" The rancher's answer was a long, tired silence. That night, as coyotes howled and wind rattled the shutters, Aiyana sang softly in her language, a song of mourning, maybe, or survival. The town of Red Mesa had a way of feeding on stories, chewing them down to bone and spitting them out sharp enough to cut whoever they touched, and by the time the dust settled from Samuel's last trip for supplies, half the county was already whispering about the Apache woman living under his roof. He felt it the moment he rode in, eyes tracking him from behind curtains, men leaning a little too far over their whiskey at the saloon, the blacksmith pausing mid-swing as the hammer froze above the anvil. The world had always had rules out here, rules written in blood and prejudice, not paper, and by bringing Aiyana into his home, Samuel had broken one no man dared touch. He walked through the street slow, boots heavy, and though the stairs pressed into his back, he didn't turn. Inside the general store, Mrs. Calloway's smile was tight, her hands trembling as she filled his order. "You're looking well, Mr. Hart," she said, though her tone carried the chill of church gossip. "I heard you've taken in company." Samuel didn't answer. He simply paid, dipped his hat, and left her standing there with the kind of curiosity that festers into rumor before sundown. By the time he rode home, the wind was already carrying those rumors through the mesquite trees. Aiyana was on the porch when he arrived, her long hair loose, dark against the fading light. She didn't ask what the town had said, she didn't need to. The way Samuel's jaw clenched spoke enough. She watched him a long moment before turning her gaze toward the horizon, where the land blended into sky, her face unreadable but strong. That evening, as the cicadas began their low hum, a horse approached from the east. It was Sheriff Tom Dane, his badge dulled from years of dust and regret. He dismounted slow, hat in hand, his boots crunching the gravel as he approached the porch. "Sam," he said quietly, "you're stirring up something that won't settle easy." His eyes flicked toward Aiyana and then back. "You know folks out here, they scare easy, and scared folks turn mean." Samuel met his gaze, steady as a drawn gun. "I ain't done nothing wrong," Dane sighed, running a hand over his weathered face. "Maybe not. But it don't take wrong, only rumor." Aiyana stood behind Samuel, the setting sun painting her silhouette in gold and shadow. The wind caught her hair, lifting it like smoke, her eyes fixed far away as though she were hearing voices from a place beyond memory. Dane shifted, uneasy. "Just be careful," he muttered, mounting up again. Samuel nodded once. The sheriff rode off, swallowed by dusk. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The ranch lay quiet except for the creak of the porch and the breath of the desert wind. Somewhere out there, the first dog barked, signaling the end of peace. Samuel looked at Aiyana, her face calm, proud, untouchable, and knew the line between them and the world had just been drawn. The storm was coming, and both of them were already standing in its shadow. The scream tore through the midnight silence like a knife through cloth, jagged and raw, yanking Samuel from uneasy dreams of gunfire and smoke. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The old war ghosts had a way of creeping back when the dark was thick, but then he heard her voice, choked and broken, coming from the next room. The moonlight poured through the cracked window panes in long silver bars, dust floating like ghosts in the beams. Aiyana was thrashing on the cot, her hands clawing at the air, her lips forming words in a language the desert itself seemed to echo. Samuel crossed the room fast, boots heavy on the old wood, and knelt beside her. "Aiyana," he said, voice low but firm, "you're safe." She didn't wake right away. Her body trembled as though the earth itself were shaking beneath her. When her eyes opened, they were wild, unfocused, trapped somewhere far from here. "They came," she whispered hoarsely, her breath shallow, trembling like a leaf in the wind. "They came with white flags, promised peace. My father. He told us not to fear." She drew in a shuddering breath, words fractured between Apache and broken English. every syllable carrying the weight of a wound that never healed. Samuel didn't move, didn't interrupt. The fire in the hearth had long since gone cold, and the room felt carved out of silence. "They laughed when the shooting started," she said, her voice cracking. "The soldiers. They burned everything. Smoke so thick it took the sky. My mother's hair caught fire. My brother ran into the river, but..." Her words broke apart. She covered her face with both hands, but tears still slipped through her fingers. "There was a man," she whispered, voice softening like the last flicker of flame before it dies. "His name was Tasa. He tried to shield me when they fired. He fell before me. I tried to wake him." Her eyes rose to meet Samuel's, glistening, and in that moment he saw the same hollow ache that lived behind his own ribs, loss, relentless and merciless. "I can't live without love," she said finally, almost like a confession, "without someone's breath beside mine. The world is too quiet without it." The sentence lingered between them like smoke, fragile and heavy all at once. Samuel didn't reach for her, he'd learned that comfort was a thing you had to let find its own way, but his voice softened. "You're not alone here." She looked at him then, really looked, and something in her expression shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the faint awareness that he wasn't just another man come to take or pity her. She lay back slowly, her breath beginning to steady, though her eyes stayed open, reflecting the faint shimmer of the moon. Samuel sat there until the night gave way to the first thin blush of dawn, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks of the house. He'd thought she was fragile when he found her, some broken thing left behind by cruelty, but now he knew better. She wasn't broken. By the time spring cracked open the dry heart of Red Mesa, Aiyana's name had become a whisper that curdled into fear wherever it was spoken. The same men who had once tipped their hats to Samuel Hart now turned away when he rode into town, their faces pale and tight beneath the brim of their hats. The preacher at the clapboard church thundered each Sunday about unnatural unions and the sins that tempt decent men off the Lord's path, his words spilling fire that burned hotter than the desert sun. In the saloon, ranchers spoke her name with spit on their tongues, saying she was a curse, that since she'd come, the wind carried misfortune and the cattle dropped dead in the field. Samuel heard it all, and though the noise gnawed at him like wolves in the dark, he said nothing. He'd been judged before, war had already branded him with shame no sermon could match. But when they started turning him away, when the storekeeper refused his coin, claiming his hands were unclean from keeping heathen company, that silence became something else. Something heavier. The day the stone hit her, the sun was low and bleeding red across the dirt road that ran through town. Aiyana had come to fetch water, wrapped in Samuel's old duster, her face calm and unguarded. The townsfolk watched from porches and storefronts as she passed, a dozen pairs of eyes pricking her skin like needles. A boy, no older than Dane, freckles bright against his anger, picked up a rock and threw it. It struck her shoulder with a sharp crack. The street went dead quiet, every breath caught. Aiyana stopped, turned her head slow, her gaze sweeping over the boy, his mother, the preacher, the storekeeper, all of them standing frozen like cattle before a storm. She didn't scold him, didn't shout. She simply lifted her chin and looked past them all, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains, the sacred ridges where her ancestors were said to sleep beneath the earth. The wind stirred her hair, and for a heartbeat, the whole world seemed to bend around that silence, her silence. The boy dropped the second stone from his hand. His mother pulled him back, trembling, as if she'd seen something holy, or something dangerous. That night, back at the ranch, Samuel stood at the window, watching her under the starlight as she hummed an old tune by the corral. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the air like smoke, wrapping around the loneliness in his chest. "You could leave," he said quietly when she came inside, her eyes still bright with that unshaken calm. "You'd be safer." She looked at him for a long time, then shook her head once. "If I leave," she said, "they win." The words were simple, but they landed like iron. Samuel had fought for many things in his life, land, honor, ghosts, but that night, he knew he was fighting for something different now. Aiyana wasn't just surviving, she was defying, and her quiet strength frightened the town more than any weapon ever could. The night split open with the sound of shouting and the crackle of fire, dragging Samuel from uneasy sleep into a nightmare made real. The room glowed faintly red, the kind of red that meant danger, not dawn. He threw on his boots and stormed outside, the cold air cutting into his lungs like glass. Out by the corral, a cross blazed against the dark, taller than a man, wrapped in kerosene-soaked cloth, the flames clawing at the stars. The cattle bawled in panic, hooves pounding the earth. The stench of burning oil and fear filled the night, and behind the fire's roar came the sound of horses, distant, retreating. Samuel raised his rifle, scanning the black ridge beyond the barn, but whoever had come was already gone, swallowed by the desert. On the ground near the cross, someone had driven a wooden stake into the dirt, tied with a strip of white cloth marked with a crude red symbol, a circle split by a crossbar. The Purifiers. Samuel had heard of them, men who called themselves guardians of decency and blood, though everyone knew they were just cowards hiding behind firelight and scripture. He spat into the dirt, jaw tight, pulse thundering in his ears. Behind him, the door creaked open. Aiyana stood there, her hair loose, face calm and unreadable in the flickering glow. For a moment, the fire painted her like a spirit, half shadow, half flame. "They will come again," she said, her voice steady, quiet, almost tender. "But the fire doesn't scare me." Her words drifted through the air like a prayer to something ancient. Samuel turned toward her, the rifle still in his hands, his breath coming hard. "They want me to send you away," he said. "They want me to be afraid." Aiyana's gaze didn't waver. "They've already taken everything from my people that can be burned," she murmured. "The rest lives here." She placed a hand against her chest, over her heart. The silence that followed was heavy, not with fear, but with understanding. Samuel doused the flames with water from the trough, each bucket hissing as fire gave way to steam and smoke. When the cross finally fell, it did so with a sound like a sigh, collapsing into a heap of glowing embers that shimmered in the dark like dying stars. The smell lingered, burnt wood, hate, warning. Aiyana knelt by the ashes and scooped a handful into her palm, letting them slip through her fingers. "They believe fire purifies," she said, more to the night than to him. "But it only leaves scars." Samuel said nothing, just chambered a fresh round into the rifle and stared out into the emptiness. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, long, mournful, defiant. The ranch seemed smaller now, hemmed in by invisible lines drawn by men too afraid to understand. Aiyana rose, brushing soot from her hands, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The wind caught her words as she whispered something in Apache, soft, reverent. Samuel didn't ask what it meant. He didn't need to. Dawn came thin and metallic, the kind that makes every old grief look sharper, and when Sheriff Tom Dane rode up the drive his horse's hooves scuffed the frost like a judge rapping a gavel. Samuel met him on the porch, hat in hand, the weight of last night's smoke still in his hair, and before either man spoke the distance between duty and friendship hummed between them like a plucked wire. Dane was Samuel's age, they'd bled in the same wars, passed letters between one another's hands when letters mattered more than promises, and you could see that history written in the sheriff's face, lines cut deep from hard choices. He dismounted slow, boots hitting the planks with a sound that was almost apology. "Sam," he said without preamble, eyes flicking over the yard, the charred ring where the cross had burned, the horses stamping nervously, and then resting on the porch where Aiyana sat like a dark quiet thing watching the horizon. He swallowed. "You can't keep her here, Sam. Folks'll burn this place down." The words were blunt, like a hammer, but they carried something more, fear masked as duty. Samuel leaned against the rail, feeling the wood splinter at the pressure of his own silence. He wanted to argue, to remind Dane of the oath he'd taken to uphold the law for every soul, not only the comfortable ones, but the law in these parts had teeth only for some. He thought of the soldiers Aiyana had described, of promises wrapped in white flags that turned to smoke. He thought of the men who'd stared at him sideways these last weeks, of the preacher's sermons and the storekeeper's refusal to take his coin. He had been a man who measured risk in miles and bodies, and the arithmetic had always been simple: keep your name clean, your land fenced, and no one asks questions. But Samuel looked at Aiyana, at the way the morning wind toyed with her hair, at how she kept her hands folded in her lap like a prayer, and something inside him that had gone quiet during the war came awake. He thought of all the times he'd watched men die in places that didn't care. He thought of the hollow left behind that no liquor or ledger could patch. "Then let 'em try," he said, voice low as a winter creak, not loud enough to be bravado, just honest. Dane's jaw tightened. For a beat the sheriff looked like a man about to break, then he coughed and straightened, the badge on his chest catching the pale light like a question he couldn't answer. He shifted his weight, eyes returning to Aiyana, taking in the calm steel there, the way she did not flinch or plead, only sat with that strange, terrible dignity that made Samuel feel both foolish and fortunate. "You don't understand what it stirs up," Dane said finally, quieter now, the man's conscience bleeding through the official. "People get scared. Scared people get mean. I can't stop 'em all, Sam. The sheriff's hand hovered near his holster and then fell away. His friendship was in his silence as much as his warning. The sky over the western plains was a bruised, heavy purple, the kind of color that promised more than just rain. It promised a reckoning, and the air itself was thick, still, and humming with an unspoken tension that mirrored the taut silence between Samuel and Aiyana as they worked to secure the last of the boundary fences before the inevitable downpour. They moved with a practiced, wordless efficiency, her small, strong hands feeding wire through the posts. He drove deep into the stubbornly dry earth, each swing of the hammer a blunt, rhythmic echo against the impending storm, a sound that, paradoxically, filled the void in Samuel more effectively than any conversation could have. All day, they were a study in parallel motion, sweat stinging their eyes, dust coating their clothes, driven by the shared, immediate goal of protecting the meager cattle herd. But when the sun finally dipped, leaving a fiery red scar on the horizon, the real work began, the delicate, painful dance of existing side by side in the small, familiar circle of firelight. The fire was small, crackling, throwing nervous shadows that stretched and shrank the walls of the tiny, dilapidated cabin they shared, and the only sounds were the distant, low growl of thunder and the soft hiss of the sap burning in the wood, a silence Samuel once found oppressive, a constant reminder of his failure and the weight of his self-imposed penance, a silence he had initially tried to fill with futile reassurances, with the language of a savior to a victim. But now, as he watched Aiyana meticulously sharpen her scavenged hunting knife, her gaze focused and steady, he realized the narrative had silently and completely reversed. She didn't look like someone to be saved, but someone who had already salvaged herself from the wreckage of the past, and every day spent working beside her, every night sharing this simple, stark existence, was a subtle form of therapy, a slow leaching of the bitterness and emptiness that had calcified around his heart. He saw the resilience in the set of her jaw, the quiet competence in her every action, and understood with a startling clarity that she was not just surviving the world, she was teaching him how to survive his own crushing self-condemnation, pulling him back, piece by agonizing piece, from the precipice of his own emotional ruin. That realization, unbidden and profound, shifted the foundation of their entire dynamic, stripping away the thin, false layer of pity he had worn like a badge of moral superiority, replacing it with something raw, necessary, and undeniably real. It happened, as such things often do, in a moment of utter banality, reaching across the small, worn table for the tin of salted meat, his calloused fingertips inadvertently brushed the back of her hand, a contact so fleeting it lasted less than a heartbeat, yet the electric shock that arced between them was a jolt of pure, undiluted sensation. The setting sun, a vast, malevolent eye peering through the bruised clouds, bled across the western sky, painting the plains and the humble, isolated homestead in shades of desperate crimson and stark, ominous black, creating a dramatic, terrifying stage for the violence that was about to erupt, and the silence that had reigned between Samuel and Aiyana all day suddenly felt less like peace and more like the pressurized stillness before a bomb drops. They both knew it was coming, the persistent rumors carried on the wind, the uneasy feeling that had been settling over the valley like a shroud, and then, the sight, a long, dark line of riders emerging from the distant woods, their silhouettes jagged and unnerving against the dying light, moving with a predatory slowness that spoke of absolute confidence and malice. As the thunder of hooves grew louder, vibrating through the packed earth, Samuel felt the familiar, cold knot of dread tighten in his gut, but this time, it was laced with a ferocious protectiveness, a feeling completely new and utterly consuming, and he found Aiyana already standing beside him, not behind, her posture rigid, her face expressionless but for the fierce, dark fire burning in her eyes. They stood side by side near the weathered, sturdy barn, the only structure substantial enough to offer a measure of cover, and as the vigilantes, a ragged, menacing group of 8, their faces hidden behind crude strips of cloth, their intentions illuminated by the wild, dancing flames of the torches they carried, pulled their horses to a sudden, dusty halt 50 yards away. The air became thick with the smell of cheap kerosene, sweat, and impending death. A voice, raw and distorted by the mask, bellowed an unintelligible demand, but before the words could even fully register, the conversation ended. The first shot cracked the twilight air, a high, sharp sound that was instantly followed by the dull, wet thwack of a bullet embedding itself in the dirt a foot from Samuel's boot, sending a spray of dry soil and pebbles flying. There was no hesitation, no moment of moral debate this time, only the instinctive, brutal reaction of a man pushed to his limit. Samuel dropped into a crouch, the heavy Henry rifle already leaping to his shoulder, and fired a rapid-fire sequence of 3 shots back toward the center of the hostile line. The sudden eruption of gunfire was the signal for chaos to descend, turning the pastoral dusk into a blinding, deafening hellscape. But amidst the rising smoke and the shouts of angry men, Aiyana remained a pillar of unnatural calm. While Samuel reloaded with frantic, practiced haste, she made no sound, simply reaching down with smooth, economical movements to grab the spare Spencer repeater rifle he had leaned against the barn wall, a weapon nearly as tall as she was. It wasn't the first time he'd seen her handle a gun, but tonight, there was a lethal finality in her actions. The final volley of gunfire faded into a dreadful, ringing silence, broken only by the frantic whinnying of horses scattering into the darkness and the ravenous roar of the flames consuming the barn, which had taken a stray lantern or perhaps a carefully placed torch during the confusion of the ambush, its roof now collapsing inward with a sickening crunch of burning timber, casting a hellish, pulsating light over the immediate area where Samuel and Aiyana stood in the dust. Aiyana was the first to realize the danger had passed, lowering the heavy rifle, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, her focus snapping immediately from the retreating shadows to the man beside her, who had slumped against the charred wood of a fence post, a dark, spreading stain blooming rapidly across his left side where a bullet had found its mark. The adrenaline that had fueled their desperate defense began to recede, leaving Samuel pale and suddenly frighteningly heavy as Aiyana eased him down to the ground, her movements imbued with a frantic, protective tenderness that belied her usual reserved demeanor. She tore a strip from the hem of her own worn skirt, her fingers working swiftly and efficiently to staunch the flow of blood, her concentration absolute, blotting out the sight of the blazing barn and the acrid smell of smoke and spent gunpowder, her mind focused solely on the fragile life ebbing beneath her touch, and as she worked, a low, guttural sound began to escape her lips, not a cry of grief or panic, but a steady, hypnotic murmur, a sequence of melodic syllables he didn't understand, an ancient Apache prayer of protection and passage that felt to Samuel like the cool, cleansing brush of wind through cedar trees in a distant, forgotten mountain. He tried to speak, to assure her he was fine, but a searing white-hot pain lanced through him, stealing his breath, leaving him only with a ragged whisper. As Aiyana cradled his head in her lap, her cheek resting gently against his soot-stained hair, lending her strength to his failing body, he fought through the haze of pain and the creeping cold to articulate the profound truth that had dawned on him during their desperate fight, a realization more essential than the battle itself. He grasped her hand, his strength fading fast, his voice thin as dry paper, and managed to push the words past his lips. "You never needed me, Aiyana. You just needed the truth." The weight of his guilt, the arrogance of his initial savior complex, finally lifted, replaced by a deep, humbling respect for the woman who had fought beside him, who had needed a shield only long enough to stand on her own ground, and with that final, honest acknowledgement of her immense, independent strength, his eyes fluttered shut, his body going slack against hers. For a long, unbearable moment, the desert seemed to hold its collective breath, the crackle of the fire and the distant howls of coyotes silenced by the stark. Weeks passed in the stark, relentless fashion of the high desert, and the sun, indifferent to human sorrow or violence, rose and set over the scarred, rebuilt homestead, yet no cheerful column of smoke now rose from the chimney, only the thin, transparent shimmer of heat rising from the ground, a spectral presence where the barn once stood, and the silence that had once been shared between Samuel and Aiyana was now hers alone, a deep, pervasive quiet broken only by the creak of the well pulley or the soft, rhythmic pounding of a hammer mending what the fire hadn't taken. The nearby townsfolk, a fearful and gossiping lot, continued to pass the ranch on the dusty road that skirted the property line, but their glances were always rapid, darting, and immediately averted, as though the ground itself were cursed, or perhaps as if the sheer defiance embodied by the solitary figure they saw working the fields was too sharp a reflection of their own passive fear during the attack. The only emotion besides her own was a single, sturdy white horse, Samuel's favorite mare, that she now kept tethered near the house, allowing it a long lead to run the fence line, a beautiful, fluid streak of white against the ochre landscape, a constant, living tribute to the man who was gone. Aiyana had changed subtly in the interim, the fierce, protective energy that had carried her through the fight now channeled into a quiet, almost ritualistic care for the land. She wore his old, sweat-stained leather hat, a practical concession to the harsh sun, but also a profound, unspoken statement of continuity and ownership, and with the passing of each sunrise, she systematically worked the fences, checked the few remaining cattle, and meticulously restored order to the chaos of the ruins, her hands calloused but gentle, Her movements measured, radiating an aura of absolute resolve. Her presence was solid, undeniable, a silent promise to the ground that it would not be abandoned, and her new solitude wasn't a sign of defeat but a hardening, a final shedding of any reliance on external protection. She had been saved not by Samuel's rifle, but by the fierce necessity that he had finally acknowledged. Travelers, few and far between in this lonely stretch, occasionally paused, drawn by curiosity or concern, or sometimes just plain thirst, and though Aiyana would offer water without complaint, she spoke very little, her answers clipped, direct, and final, discouraging prolonged conversation. When one such man, a curious salesman passing through, asked her name, she gave it simply, and when he followed up, probing gently about her circumstances and inquiring as to her man's whereabouts, she paused from her work, pushing the brim of Samuel's hat up with a thoughtful, decisive finger. Her eyes, still filled with that ancient, deep light, met his without fear or challenge, and her voice, though soft, carried the inescapable resonance of authority, the simple, final truth of her new existence. Years turned into a decade, the seasons cycling through their brutal, indifferent rhythms, and the homestead once scorched by fire now stood as a solid, functional monument to sheer will, its low-slung cabin and newly built corral a subtle but permanent scar on the vast, unforgiving landscape. And as the decades wore on, the factual events of the siege and its aftermath began to erode, becoming instead the soft clay of myth and legend that travelers shaped and reshaped around distant campfires. Aiyana, the woman who had stood her ground, became the central figure in a kaleidoscope of contradictory frontier tales, each teller projecting their own fear, hope, or prejudice onto her silent silhouette, and the ranch itself was no longer just a dot on a map but a reference point for the supernatural. Some stories, particularly those passed among the beleaguered settlers and homesteaders who struggled against the harshness of the land, painted her as a figure of quiet grace and immense skill, claiming she eventually turned the ranch into a refuge, a self-sufficient commune where she used ancient Apache knowledge combined with practical frontier remedies, becoming a revered healer whose hands could mend broken bones and soothe fevered minds, and the very air around her was said to smell faintly of cedar and sage, a comforting scent that promised life where the desert offered only death. Conversely, the more fearful and often younger men, those who feared what they couldn't control, favored a darker, more romanticized narrative. They claimed that after securing her small piece of territory, she sold the meager cattle, packed her few possessions, and simply vanished into the mountains flanking the distant Red Mesa, returning to the elusive, ghost-like remnant of her people, an ancient spirit reclaiming its birthright. And this version concluded with the chilling, often repeated detail that if one listened closely to the wind whistling through the high peaks, they could hear the faint, echoing sound of her people's drums. Despite the varying claims, all the legends coalesced around one undisputed, magnetic image, that of a solitary rider. In dusty saloons and around glowing embers, old men with eyes like cracked leather would still whisper of catching a glimpse of a woman on a white horse, always Samuel's mare, which she had kept intended, riding across the plains just as the sun dipped, turning the sky an unbelievable crimson, casting the mesa in a bloody, dramatic light. And whether she was a healer, an outlaw, or a ghost, the wind that followed her trail carried one undeniable truth, a testament to the immense, quiet power she possessed. She was never the one who was defined by lack, never the one who couldn't live without the protection of a man. Rather, it was the men, the vigilantes she routed, the travelers she briefly encountered, the storytellers she haunted, who couldn't live without the compelling, terrifying legend of her existence.